Thank you everyone for joining our fourth and final panel of the symposium before our working group sessions and keynote this afternoon. This panel is entitled Conflict, Disaster, and Climate Change, and it will be from now until 1:45 p.m. My name is Laura Zanotti. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. Just a couple orders of business before we begin. First is that we will have a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to post any questions in the chat box throughout this discussion this afternoon. We'd be happy to return back to them at the end of the session. There's also a live closed captioner in this session. If you look to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be an option for live transcript. Finally, I just wanted to make a note that the session is being recorded and will be archived on the Center for the Environment Symposium web page, but we will be removing the discussion portion of it, even though the recording will go throughout. So if that's of concern, I just wanted to note that. So without further ado, I'd like to first introduce all of our esteemed panelists and discussants, and then hand it over to our first presenter. And so today in this panel, we have Dr. Fuchsia Ann Hoover, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. Dr. Hoover is a socio-ecological urban hydrologist focused on exploring the intersections of urban stormwater, hydrology, green infrastructure, or GI, and ecosystem services through the environmental justice lens. I will move just really quickly, briefly to the next three speakers, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Hoover. Dr. David Johnson is an assistant professor of industrial engineering and political science in political science at Purdue University. His work uses simulation modeling, economic analysis, and decision support tools to improve environmental policies and adaptation to climate change. Dr. Michael Mendez, who's our third speaker, is an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine. And you probably heard us talking a little bit earlier that we're so excited that in this virtual format that he can be with us today. He previously was the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot, is that how you pronounce that? Maybe not. Faculty Fellow in Sustainability Studies and Associate Research Scientist at the Yale School of the Environment. Dr. Mendez has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors where he consulted and actively engaged in policymaking process. And then finally, Dr. Lee Raymond, for those of you on Purdue's campus in the climate change space or environment space, possibly know him very well in his work. He is a professor of political science at Purdue University, and his recent work has been on changing in the atmospheric commons, and he's an interdisciplinary scholar who received his PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley and a BA from Yale University. All of their full bios can be seen on our symposium webpage. I just wanted to give a brief introduction to each. Dr. Raymond will be the discussant today, with the three panelists going first. So I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Fuchsia Ann Hoover to kick us off for this session and build on the wonderful conversations we've been having the last 2 days, especially some of the conversations we've had just a moment ago. So Dr. Hoover, I'm going to pass it to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. All right, so holler if you can't see the presentation slides. So again, I'm Dr. Fuchsia Hoover. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am going to be talking a couple different things, including some of my own research, but it's all framed around this idea of environmental justice and green stormwater infrastructure. So the question I pose today is why we should consider justice when designing green infrastructure and how we do that. But before we dive in, I like to ground myself in the work. So I'm an engineer and a hydrologist, but I'm also trained in qualitative methods from anthropology and natural resource management. I'm also a Black woman, and my experiences both growing up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and being an engineer have really shaped the types of questions that I ask and the methods that I use. And I argue that this is true for all of us across the work that we do, the communities that we engage with, and the questions that we ask. And so the question that I'm asking today is, why should we consider justice when designing green infrastructure? So first, it's important to understand what green infrastructure is. In the United States, green infrastructure as an urban planning tool and terminology emerged in the early 2000s, and there are currently over 153 unique definitions used by cities across the country, not including cities and countries outside the United States. However, one of the dominant definitions in both research and practice comes from the Environmental Protection Agency, who define it as a material, vegetation, or technology that is improving water quality or managing stormwater in some way. So I've provided a couple examples of what green infrastructure or GI looks like in practice with the photos at the bottom. And I'll refer to green infrastructure as GI going forward, but typically when you see them, they are often smaller in size. They may have some type of vegetation in them, or in the example of a cistern or rain barrel, there may not be any vegetation. But for the most part, they've been growing in use and popularity for more than a decade. And so to really dig into the question that I posed at the beginning, we have to acknowledge that we live in uneven geographies. And for those who may be unfamiliar with this term, uneven geographies describes the inequitable investments and disinvestments of infrastructure and its associated resource acquisition, allocation, and management across the landscape. This unevenness is based on systemic processes that are neither arbitrary nor individualized. And I think that's a really key point to this when we're thinking about the way that we think about these uneven geographies manifesting in our landscape at multiple levels of scale. So specifically, this unevenness is the result of centuries-long structural and racist city planning, as illustrated on the left from Chris Schell's recent Science article. And this figure demonstrates the way that systemic biases sit at the foundation to all of our landscapes and roots all other types of environmental planning, resource management, and distribution. Dexter Locke's work provides an excellent example of this foundation manifested. In this case, he and his colleagues identified statistically significant relationships between tree canopy cover and historical neighborhood Holt grades, which is the grading system that gave way to redlining and other forms of housing segregation policies. In this case, neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, even Jewish, or immigrant were rated as at risk or higher risk for defaulting on home loans, and therefore given a D rating, which is visible in the color red. Meanwhile, A grades, noted in the color green, were assigned to predominantly white Christian neighborhoods, as these residents were viewed as being more reliable and financially secure. And so as noted in their figure, A-graded neighborhoods have significantly higher canopy cover than D-rated neighborhoods. And this pattern is consistent across the US, from Los Angeles and Seattle to Philadelphia and New York, which they highlight, and Chicago's in there as well, and Cleveland, right? So we have West Coast, East Coast, and Midwest cities all included as part of this manifestation of our uneven geographies. So to drive home this connection, I want to ground GI in the history of green space, with these three cities showing different manifestations of green space. So in Los Angeles on the left, historically green space was installed by the city, but was the responsibility of individual residents and property owners to maintain, including watering and other forms of pesticide maintenance. So therefore we see a prevalence of green space often associated with higher income, wealthier communities. And I want to note that income is closely tied to race in the United States, hence the relationship between tree canopy cover and the Holt grading from the previous slide for LA that we saw. In Baltimore, Maryland, in the center, green space was used as a tool for reinforcing segregation and an indicator for whiteness. So predominantly white neighborhoods were more heavily greened and planned with integrated green space, shown in the area north of the arrow, than Black or brown neighborhoods to the south. And finally, St. Louis, Missouri on the right, which is representative of many post-industrial cities across the Midwest. We see a section of predominantly Black North St. Louis with pockets of green space scattered across the neighborhood. In this case, the prevalence of green spaces are due to the high rate of vacant lots and demolished homes in the area. So what does this have to do with stormwater and green infrastructure? Well, these histories have yet to be remedied or addressed in a significant and meaningful way. So as a result, we see these biased patterns and processes extend into GI. In Sarah Heck's recent paper, Greening the Color Line, she examines St. Louis's stormwater management program, Project Clear, and not only identifies heavy investment in GI in North St. Louis, but connects this investment to demolition locations as shown in the figure. She articulates the way that legacies of neglect and disinvestment are now used to justify the use of GI under rationale like reduced costs or available land. The implementation of GI thereby mirrors these same uneven geographies, and as a result, cheaper, more unequal investments are once again being concentrated in communities of color. And unfortunately, our current and future planning around stormwater management practices will continue to replicate these uneven geographies until we change our metrics and approaches. So this leads us to the big question of how do we lead with a justice-centered practice when designing and implementing GI, particularly when thinking about things like risk or mitigation and climate change. So one of the first things we need to integrate into our GI work is siting and evaluation, monitoring that is associated with green infrastructure, specifically examining the metrics and criteria used to locate green infrastructure, and whether environmental justice or equity is built into either of these stages. So this is a key focus of my current work, and it's incredibly important because if the criteria doesn't exist, then it's unlikely to be considered a priority. And what's further, that then prevents us from having a foundation from which to monitor or evaluate the success of the GI and whether benefits are being actualized. So this figure on the right that you see, my colleagues and I have examined 120 city planning documents across 20 US cities for GI siting criteria and rationale. And while the number of plans per city varied, as you can see, for most, at least 25% or more of the plans were dedicated to GI siting criteria broadly, the exception being San Juan and Denver. However, less than 6% of siting criteria mentioned equity or environmental justice. Even community health and well-being were not common criteria despite their frequent mention as motivation and rationale for using GI in the first place. Much of the community engagement mentioned is passive and relies on pre-existing relationships with neighborhoods or other resident-led engagement with the city through various other programs or practices. And so these results really show us that we have to be explicit about the metrics for siting, monitoring, and evaluating GI's performance with respect to environmental justice and equity. And this is going to look different for every municipality. Given the reduced financial resources, institutional and personal, that many minoritized communities experience, a second element is the creation of budgets or funds to exclusively support the maintenance of GI placed in minoritized communities. So part of this recommendation speaks to a need to address the aforementioned disinvestment practices, particularly when GI is used as the cheaper option to manage stormwater. A consistent and reliable maintenance budget is an important supplement to balance some of those historical financial overinvestments in predominantly white neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods, and the historical financial underinvestment and disinvestments in our predominantly Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and neighborhoods. And so finally, as we're really thinking about environmental justice and equity, it's really important that we consider the historical underinvestment and disinvestment and how we might remedy that through the use of GI. So as I conclude, I want to leave you with several guiding questions to consider when we're thinking about GI for stormwater management. And really, I think this applies to any type of climate change mitigation or risk assessment or processes that cities and communities are engaging or thinking about implementing. So the first question is to ask yourself, what are the benefits to the residents where GI is being implemented? So specifically, how are we measuring or evaluating these benefits? And are these benefits even things that the residents themselves have identified either as a want or a need? And I've heard this mentioned in a couple of the prior panels from today and yesterday, and this idea of knowledge creation and who forms the body of knowledge that we use, and the way that communities and personal experiences are a part of that knowledge creation, or should be a part of that. And so part of this question is an attempt to speak to that, right? I think oftentimes as engineers, scientists, researchers, we forget often that the communities in which we're working or serving are truly the ones who are going to know what they need best, right? Because they are living there, they are having those day-to-day interactions with their environment. And so really asking and getting to the root of some of the intention behind what are we trying to do when we're thinking about the particular plans or implemented practices we are using is a key question to be asking. So next we need to ask what supportive policies are needed alongside the implementation of GI. So if you think about neighborhoods where housing availability or affordability is a concern, then what types of policies are necessary to prevent phenomena like green gentrification or other forms of resident displacement in spaces where GI is placed? And so this is thinking back to the image of St. Louis, Missouri, where you saw lots of pockets of available green space due to a lack of available affordable housing stock. And so there are a lot of great opportunities for municipal departments, state and federal agencies, and nonprofits to work together in meaningful ways to plan strong and supportive and ultimately just GI practices, policies, and programs. And the increase in communication and resource sharing across these cities' departments speaks to this growing opportunity. And so it's really a place where we can harness really trying to engage what environmental just planning and practices would look like. And then finally, the most important question that we have to ask ourselves is if GI, in my case, and particularly with my research, is truly the best approach, or if it's simply the cheapest one. As I mentioned, one of the challenges in using GI for stormwater management and thinking about flooding risk are the unameliorated patterns of unequal investments across the landscape. So it's all the more important to determine if GI is being implemented across minoritized communities because it's a substantially reduced investment overall, or because it will truly provide the necessary services that will serve those residents. And so I just wanted to show this very briefly. So these are some additional results from the analysis that I've been conducting on the city plans. And as you can see, environmental justice showed up in three primary ways. Most of the times refer to either a specific population, like specific communities of color, or prioritizing low-income communities of color, or it referenced some other type of underinvestment or distributional element of an amenity, whether that be green space. And so the social kind of larger group category here with the subgroup of environmental justice, you could see, well, it may be difficult. Hopefully you can see, but it's a very, very small component. And so finally, I'll just leave you with my contact information. And these are the articles that I mentioned in the presentation, and they should be available on the conference website where you registered, or I'm sure you can reach out to Dr. Zanoda and she can provide them to you. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hoover, for that wonderful presentation and kind of exploring the ways in which green infrastructure intersects with some of these discussions that we've been having on knowledge creation, as well as uneven development and economic policy, as well as the systemic change associated with that and success and historical legacies of that. I really love that you introduced the idea of uneven geographies to the panel. So hopefully we can continue the conversation. With that, I'd like to pass it to Dr. David Johnson for the second presentation of the panel.
All right, I'll go ahead and pull up my screen. Okay, hopefully that has everything in the right place. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be talking about equity considerations in flood risk management. As Professor Zanotti mentioned earlier, I'm David Johnson. I'm an assistant professor in industrial engineering and political science. My background is actually trained in math for my bachelor's and master's, and then my PhD is in policy analysis, kind of a broadly interdisciplinary area. And so I've gotten involved in working with the state of Louisiana since around 2009 on flood risk modeling for their coastal master plan. And I've done a lot of other work just broadly on climate change adaptation and environmental policy making under conditions of deep uncertainty about what the future will hold. So I'm going to talk today about some equity considerations related to flood risk management by first briefly giving some context about how flood risk is typically distributed within Louisiana, but then also in other geographies. Talk a little bit about some of the environmental justice issues with current flood risk management practices, and then also discuss some opportunities to improve those outcomes and what can we be doing differently in order to better address equity considerations and environmental justice when thinking about risk from flooding now and in the future. So in my own context, a lot of what I've done in Louisiana, of course, has been rooted in the experience of the coastal communities during Hurricane Katrina. The Gulf was kind of radically reshaped and changed forever by Katrina when it hit in 2005. But as a number of different geographers and anthropologists and others have noted, the effects were not felt equally across the Gulf. Here you can see an overhead view from NASA of New Orleans shortly after Katrina hit, after the levees were breached and much of the city flooded. And the impacts in New Orleans were disproportionately borne by elderly populations and at the city's African-American population. And this was actually contrary to some initial analyses that have been done, which actually suggested that the white population of the city was disproportionately affected. And I'll talk a little bit about why some of those analyses reached that conclusion early on. But I'll point out that this is a case where intersectionality really matters. That if you are considering just the white population in New Orleans at the time, that they were a smaller percentage of the city population, but they did seem to be disproportionately affected in terms of loss of life and damage to their homes or displacement. And a number of different metrics were sort of suggesting this early on. But a more careful analysis of this showed that the white population in New Orleans at the time was also disproportionately elderly. And it's that combination that was resulting in having a higher likelihood of dying during the storm, and the fact that the elderly population in the city was also much more likely to be living in poverty, have less access to private vehicles, and consequently be less mobile, which is really what was determining the loss of life during the storm, is people that were stuck in the city and unable to evacuate. So this is a general pattern, and it was alluded to in one of the first sessions yesterday where someone mentioned Katrina, and then I think Rachel noted that it's not just exposure to risk and natural hazards that drives the outcomes associated with it. It's that populations are also differently vulnerable to those hazards, regardless of where they're living and whether or not they're exposed to them. Community resilience and kind of the ability to adapt and bounce back from an event when it occurs is also differently distributed throughout different populations. And so hazards are natural, but disasters are constructed in the sense that our vulnerability to natural hazards is the result of a lot of different factors that in the US have typically been associated with minoritized status, economic disadvantage, and weak social support structures. So the experience during Hurricane Katrina is consistent with other disasters and flood risk more generally, that in the US, vulnerability to disasters, not just flooding, but others as well, is particularly greater for communities of color. And so this figure is showing the color shading in the city, showing the percentage of population in each neighborhood that is Black. And the dots represent the locations of where individuals, where casualties were located within the city. And you can see that there is a much higher concentration in heavily and predominantly Black neighborhoods. So I'm going to also show a couple of other different figures like this, where orange represents some characteristic that's being mapped that is more associated with vulnerable populations, and blue being a less typically vulnerable group. And you can see that now, this is from the 2019 American Community Survey, that New Orleans, after recovering from Katrina, is highly segregated. But this actually wasn't always the case. It was when Katrina hit as well, but historically, it wasn't the case. And so it raises the question of why the Black community in New Orleans was more vulnerable during the storm, why they were more likely to have lost their life or have been displaced and unable to return. And so when we're thinking about the broader experience of how flood risk is distributed within the US, I think that this comes about from a number of different reasons. One being that existing management practices in the US in terms of how flood protection projects are evaluated and approved and budgeted for, they have potential to perpetuate some of the inequities that already exist, in that our existing flood management policies and programs in the US do not consider environmental justice and don't consider some of these uneven geographies that Dr. Hoover was just talking about. That flood mapping on the whole is underfunded. Maps are not very frequently updated. There is a federal statute that says flood maps should be evaluated and potentially revised by FEMA at least every 5 years. But I'll point out that in 2017, when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, some of the flood maps in Harris County, where Houston is located, were still from the 1980s. So they are not necessarily frequently updated. So people don't have access to good information. And my suspicion is that maps are more often updated in more affluent communities that are better able to advocate for protection, which is evaluated on the basis of cost effectiveness. So decision frameworks based on benefit cost analysis that say we can approve a levy system and fund it, partly if the local community is able to afford a cost share requirement under some programs. But in general, any large infrastructure project like a levy system or a flood wall has to pass a benefit cost test in terms of producing a greater amount of net benefit than the cost of the project. And that ignores distributive justice considerations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But the other aspect here is that vulnerable populations are simply less mobile and unable to relocate themselves to areas that are lower risk. And some studies have found that buyout and relocation programs after disasters are often based on politically influenced analysis that are not very transparent. So if we think about this second issue, that benefit cost analysis is the basis of decision-making for flood risk protection projects, there are a couple of competing hypotheses at work here in terms of what the EJ outcome might be of flood risk management programs. On the one hand, you'll have a higher benefit cost ratio if you are protecting a more affluent community that has higher home values and higher income properties. And so you can see here, again, orange being more vulnerable communities or characteristics, and blue being less vulnerable characteristics, that the median home value on the right is distributed in more of the same pattern that we saw on previous slides in terms of median home values being very strongly correlated with predominantly Black neighborhoods. And same with median household income in the city. So it becomes more beneficial from a pure economic perspective to protect properties that are worth more. But on the other hand, more affluent communities are commonly located on higher ground. And so they have a lower baseline level of risk. And so there's this opposite impact where higher value community or higher value properties may be less beneficial to protect because they have a lower baseline of risk in the first place. So you can't reduce as much risk because they don't have as much risk at the start. And the reason for this, and something that we see continuing today in a lot of other places, not just New Orleans, is this effect that's been called climate gentrification, in that we are starting to see some response in property values and people trying to relocate to areas that are higher ground at lower risk with more awareness of potential climate change in the future. And more vulnerable communities don't have the capacity necessarily to move to higher ground, and they're getting priced out of lower risk communities. So those two impacts together, it's unclear in many communities as to kind of which of those effects might be dominating. In New Orleans, it actually turns out that this particular effect is less strong, in that more vulnerable communities are not actually located at lower elevation, or you can see the elevation on the left. And so if you've been kind of squinting at these two figures, trying to see some patterns while I've been talking, you may not have seen a whole lot, because in New Orleans, it's actually not there as strongly. There are a lot of historical reasons why more vulnerable communities are not necessarily located at lower elevation and higher risk in New Orleans. That is different from the pattern that you see in a lot of other cities throughout the US. And I can talk about that a little bit during the Q&A if there's interest about kind of the historical nature of how New Orleans has evolved. But if we want to think about how to address these issues, there's the question of how do we best incorporate information about fairness and equity into analyses of how we should allocate funding to reduce flood risk. We have a number of different ways that we could do this. And just one example here is that you may come up with very different preferences for how you should allocate funds to, say, elevate people's houses, or raise foundations for new construction like we see in the picture here, or to flood-proof properties. Your preferences for how to prioritize those types of projects may vary a lot, depending on whether or not your ultimate goal is to try and achieve equal level of risk in the outcome versus achieving an equal level of risk reduction across multiple communities. That can reshape your priorities somewhat drastically. And I have just one example here of some work that I've done with colleagues at RAND, showing that this is looking at Terrebonne Parish, which is southwest of New Orleans. And we tried to prioritize non-structural mitigation measures like elevating people's homes or flood-proofing commercial properties, and found that if the basis of your decision rule is purely based on risk, either flood depths now or flood depths 50 years into the future, you end up with some projects that have benefit cost ratios here on the right column that are greater than 1. These are projects that might get approved by the state. But you can see the policies, if you're just concerned with protecting low to moderate income homes, this LMI, or if you're concerned with protecting properties that have had repetitive losses in the past, that's the RL, that it lowers your benefit cost ratio. But if you consider all three of those together, so we're incorporating things like low to moderate income neighborhoods into our decision rule for prioritizing action, you actually can end up with projects that are very cost effective. And so we're not necessarily sacrificing a lot of economic efficiency to incorporate justice considerations into flood risk management decisions. And so I think that is an area that should be explored much more heavily in future and will help move us forward in correcting some of the inequalities that are currently on the landscape. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I look forward to questions after the next presentation and after Professor Raymond's discussion. And please get in touch if anyone is interested in following up on this further. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for that talk and your invitation as well to talk more about the historical context of flood management and bringing to the fore this concept of climate gentrification, as well as the discussion overall of risk mitigation. That's a bit of a tongue twister for me. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Mendez, and I look forward to the third talk in our panel before we open it up to Dr. Lee Raymond for discussing comments.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today and talking to you about these issues of climate change and environmental justice. So we heard a lot about equity lens and current planning and public policy practices around sustainability and to some extent climate change. And I want to take us back a little bit on a historical perspective, about maybe 12 years ago to Oakland, California, when we had a lot of conflict and a lot of consultation over how do we conceptualize climate change? Who does climate change represent? In our contemporary moment, foregrounding people of color is sort of starting to gain momentum and people accepting that sort of equity lens. About 12, 15 years ago, that was sort of a radical notion. As we can see from this flyer that the Oakland Climate Action Coalition, primarily a social justice, environmental justice organization, really want to change that sort of tired image about climate change being solely global, about nature out there and not in the backyards, not in the streets of Oakland. And to have the refrain, it's not just about polar bears. It's also about climate justice and the youth and people of color. For example, Brian Brevidge with the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project told me 12 years ago, up until the last decade, climate change tended to be a white, affluent issue about saving the rainforest and polar bears. It hasn't had deep relevance for people trying every day to get by in the urban centers. Most of the messages of climate change are about eliminating global greenhouse gas emissions and not about people. So if we take this to our contemporary movement in my book, Climate Change from the Streets, how conflict and collaboration strengthen the environmental justice movement, I really show how in California, we are experiencing a major climate crisis over the years and historic racial unrest. For example, in the last year alone, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major life events. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. To address the climate emergency, activists and policymakers have proposed a Green New Deal at the federal level, a radical proposal to decarbonize the economy and address poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and are often met with significant resistance. While I'm supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm here to say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like California since the year 2000 have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists who favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. These conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science of climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions claim to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships and all the competing interests, power, and racial struggles that this implies. So if we look towards the example of California, it reveals the contingent nature of climate policy, the assumptions and social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. In California, tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, class, and race. These differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust, even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change could do to our human societies and our planet. So for insight into national level conflicts between groups working on climate change, one should look to the nearly 2-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policies. For environmental justice activists in California, the main threat to climate change is the disproportionate harm it causes to their bodies and the health of their communities. For them, climate change is not just about global greenhouse gas models. Rather, it is also about opposing worldviews through which policy and science is seen. Yet in California, it is still often seen as this homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural settings. It also obscures how the localization of environmental policy and science within the state involves processes of public consultation and legitimacy. For example, in this recent book published by a major university press, it describes itself as the definitive book on California's environmental history. And in its 300-page book, people of color are only mentioned twice in basically a footnote. So there's this continued traditional environmental narrative of California that facilitates the erasure of people of color and enacting comprehensive environmental policy and leadership. Therefore, I published my book, Climate Change from the Streets, with the explicit focus on people of color. My book foregrounds people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. This research originated in my public policy work for the California State Legislature during a 15-year period. This provided me valuable insight into how the interactions of government, businesses, and NGOs shape climate change policy. My research is further influenced by my experience growing up in Latino immigrant communities of Los Angeles that face multiple environmental threats. At the youth in Pacoima and Sylmar, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental racism. Whether protesting the siting of landfills or organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties, they sought to understand how these situations originated, to develop alternatives, and to imagine new environmental futures. Therefore, this has focused my work on what the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change has meant to activists, policymakers, experts, and scholars alike. Understanding this is important because the idea of environmental justice has been growing in scope beyond its initial application to the inequitable distributions of hazardous waste dumps and poor communities of color. My work analyzed the expansion of environmental justice policy discourse and the ways in which it has challenged definitions of nature and society. When I began this working research project in California, I was struck by the lack of scholarship on the narratives of environmental justice in the context of climate change. The literature shows a real neglect of environmental justice groups' worldview and influence in the climate change policy arena. The lack of a narrative perspective is largely due to the fact that since the 1980s, environmental justice studies has sought to legitimize itself as an area of serious academic inquiry. The first generation of environmental justice scholars in general focus on causality and quantifying environmental inequality through the lens of race and class at a single scale. However, an emerging second generation has extended the field to incorporate a deeper consideration of critical theory and intersectionality, the ways in which gender, class, sexuality, immigration status, and other human identities shape environmental justice struggles at multiple scales. This second generation has been dubbed critical environmental justice studies and focuses on four important questions that are central to my own work. The first question asks, how does intersectionality, multiple forms of difference in human identities, gender, immigration status, sexuality, influence environmental justice outcomes? To what extent should scholars focus on a single scale or multi-scale analyses of the causes and possible resolutions to environmental justice struggles? And the third question, to what degree do state power and market systems such as cap and trade entrench social inequality? And the final question, how can marginalized groups whose participation is indispensable to society shape sustainable and collective futures? So based on this critical environmental justice study lens, the key argument in my book is for society to successfully resolve the phenomenon of climate change, critical attention must be placed on the human dimensions of climate policymaking, such as local knowledge, culture, and history, and it should be done at multiple scales. Central to this argument is a demonstration that environmental protection and improving public health are uniquely linked, and maintaining that link is key to advancing future climate action policies. The case of California is particularly productive as to analyze how the human dimensions of climate change policy play out on the ground. As the world's fifth largest economy and the only US state to implement a comprehensive program of regulatory and market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, California has consistently been at the forefront of broader national and global environmental experimentation. The state's cap and trade program, a central market-based mechanism for ensuring carbon emission reductions, is the third largest in the world after the European Union and China. This program has been especially contentious in debates within California. Supporters emphasize its global reach and cost effectiveness, and detractors criticize its inequitable effects on specific local communities and demographic groups. California's prominence in climate policy makes it an ideal place to investigate the dynamics of such disputes and their roots in differing climate change worldviews. My multi-sided ethnographic policy analysis in the book weaves together three interconnected multi-scale case studies. The first looks at climate and public health activism in two heavily impacted communities of color, Richmond and Oakland, California. The second looks at conflict over state-level carbon trading and use for its revenue for investments in local communities most harmed by air pollution. This takes place in Sacramento, the state capital. And the third looks at international and local implications of forest offset projects or conservation projects in the global south, Allocate, Brazil, and Chiapas, Mexico, allowed under California's market-based climate change laws. So in these multi-scalar case studies, I follow and trace activists as they travel between geographies and policy scales. For instance, in Richmond, California, it happens to have the largest oil refinery, the Chevron refinery, west of the Mississippi. And the Chevron refinery also happens to be the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the entire state of California, and also a contributor to local pollution that affects people's health. So EJ activists understand that they not only need to be protesting and advocating at City Hall in Richmond, but they also need to be jumping policy scales to have more beneficial outcomes back home. For example, California has one of the leading climate change programs, is Cap and Trade System, which really is focused on the global, and initially in the early years did not focus on neighborhoods and specifically communities of color. So activists are working simultaneously in Richmond City Hall, the state capitol, to rescale the climate change programs to focus back at neighborhoods. At the same time, they're also working on global spaces and at the United Nations and other climate conferences, because California sees itself as a nation state and has aspirations to link its cap and trade system, which is the third largest in the world, to Latin America in terms of forest offset projects, to Acre, Brazil, and Chiapas, Mexico. So these multi-scalar case studies together in my book combine to reveal the contested politics of the local, state, and transnational levels on which California makes climate change policy and takes action. And this translocal case study in particular, it jumps policy and geographic scales from the local to the global. We see how this conceptualization of environmental justice as an organizing theme has spread horizontally throughout California and how it's now vertically linked to the global South and Mexico and Brazil. In essence, environmental justice groups do not want Chevron to buy these forest conservation projects in Mexico and Brazil because they want point source reductions back home and not export reductions to the global South. And indigenous rights leaders, these are indigenous rights leaders that are not recognized by their government, groups that are not recognized by their governments and don't have land titles, do not want California to create these programs for fear that monetizing the forest is going to create dispossession of ancestral lands. So I examine how the continued collaboration, experimentation, and coalition building since 2010 have brought California environmental justice perspectives onto the global stage. This story centers on the ways in which carbon markets can create international links between local injustices and prompt new forms of translocal activism. The case, moreover, explores the spatial implications and global reach of California's carbon market, highlighting potential harms to those living among the trees and those living next to polluting industries. So this highlights that there are spatial implications and racial and equity implications of carbon markets. I can talk more about this translocal case study during our Q&A session. So in closing, my research represents new models of engagement with climate change that make space for alternative paradigms of environmental protection. My engagement with key stakeholders since 2006 has allowed me to critically analyze how the success of climate change policy in California now depends on incorporating marginalized voices and embodied perspectives from the local and global scales. So thank you for this opportunity to unpack these environmental justice and climate policy conflicts. This was a very high level overview of the book, but look forward to talking to you more about that. And also, I would just want to highlight that I recently published this article on disasters, looking at the invisible victims of disaster, understanding the vulnerability of undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. And this looks at extreme wildfire events in California and how they have impacted undocumented migrants. And we had a lot of success with this in terms of policy making and policy briefings to do some real change to safeguard these communities, and including presenting to NOAA as well as the United Nations. So this is just another aspect of looking more locally of climate adaptation and disaster planning and how people of color have historically been overlooked in disaster and climate change planning. So thank you again for this opportunity and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Mendez, and drawing attention to that recent piece. I just wanted to draw other folks' attention to the chat box that Dr. Mendez put his book link on climate change from the streets. for you to browse, and that wonderful talk that charted the climate justice movement, as well as drew attention to critical EJ perspectives, very much in conversation also with the discussion in the last panel. With that, I'd like to move to Dr. Raymond for his discussant comments.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Zanotti. Thanks to the panelists for three really different, but I think uniquely complementary perspectives on a challenging topic. This idea of, again, conflict, disaster, and climate change. I will really keep my remarks brief so we don't take up too much more of the panel's time. I just want to mention maybe a few things that didn't come up in the presentations today that I felt like are also an important part of the conversation. So the first of those is, I think, when you talk about conflict, disaster, and climate change, we have to also be thinking very prominently about global inequalities and sort of that global scale of justice. So that's just a piece that I think of this topic that also requires a great deal of attention and has some really important and complicated implications for really the subject matter of all three of the speakers, especially as we talk about a world where we're already experiencing, almost certainly, and will likely experience much more climate-driven migration, which will create even more stresses on all of the political and social and frankly, infrastructure systems, that the other speakers were all talking about. I feel like that's a critical piece of this puzzle that we're going to really need to pay a lot more attention to. And that's hard because, as Dr. Mendez was saying, that means we really have to be very multi-scalar and very nested, in thinking about our analyses, and that's quite challenging. Similarly, I'm really struck, and maybe this is partially because I have some students who are really interested in this, partially I think it's just the times, about the element of intergenerational justice that's a part of this discussion. Again, that didn't come up much today. That's fine, but I feel like that's becoming a really of growing a more and more important part or element, of thinking about the idea of environmental justice in terms of climate change in general, and really especially thinking about my interest, which is really the politics, of climate change. I'm more and more convinced that that generational shift is becoming very significant politically and has really big implications for really all of the topics that got talked about today. So I just wanted to mention that briefly as something for people to think about. I was really struck in all three presentations by an idea that we talk about a lot in political science and in the policy sciences where I work, which is this idea of path dependence. So again, Dr. Hoover's presentation and very accurately describing the ways in which decisions made decades ago, racist decisions around redlining and how to organize city planning and housing, have just continued to have profound effects, that are very hard to change because of the power of sort of increasing returns to scale and positive feedback. Really makes those decisions even more pernicious today and makes the challenges in front of us even more difficult today. And I think those same ideas really are reflected in the work that Dr. Johnson is talking about in terms of how New Orleans got to the way that it did. And I think probably then trying to figure out how to rebuild that infrastructure in a way that kind of undoes some of those choices. And I think that's also true in some ways, politically, we have a lot of path dependence around policy choices for, again, things like sort of, are we going to use a market-based solution or not, to kind of echo a little bit of what Dr. Mendez was talking about. So those questions, I think, are also really merit a lot more attention, and how does path dependence and feedback really have a big role to play here? I guess the last thing I'll just say quickly is zoom out to the really, really big picture. I think this is a bit of a personal hobby horse here, so I apologize for this, but I think we run the risk of focusing too much on the trees and not the forest when we get a little too fixated on one sort of policy design or another. And Dr. Mendez will know what I'm talking about here. I totally understand the environmental justice resistance to sort of so-called market-based policy instruments. And I'm sympathetic to that argument. I also think we would do better to focus much more on the broader issues of recognitional justice and how do we really make sure that local communities can have the kinds of climate resilience that they want? That's, I think, the key question, right? And so I hope, and I think that's where we're headed. And I think that's the really the more difficult conversation, is how do we make that sort of recognition of justice more possible, right, in our current political and economic system, which is definitely a big challenge. So, and on that final note, I'll just say that, like many of, I think, the other panelists, I have great hopes for the Green New Deal. And also as a political scientist, I think it's going to be a really critical and important question about whether the politics of that kind of a policy are going to be any more tractable than the politics of some of these other policies that have really not made much progress on climate change of late. I hope they'll be more tractable. I'm not 100% convinced that they will be more tractable. And I think that's another really critical question that we have to think about, is really what are different political systems, what kinds of designs, right, are likely to promote justice in different political systems that are going to be the most politically viable, is something that I certainly find fascinating. And I'm fascinated when advocates and activists, including EJ activists, have tremendous success leveraging ideas of fairness and justice, right, to have profound policy change, which again, Dr. Mendez's book, which I highly recommend, really does a great job of documenting how they were successful in doing that in California. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thanks again to the panelists and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Raymond, for those comments. And we don't have anything in the chat box yet, so I'll just reiterate, folks that want to ask a question, feel free to pose it in the chat box, or if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and doing so. And so just to get the discussion and conversation started, I might open up for panelists to comment on anything that Dr. Raymond just mentioned around global inequalities, multi-scalar and nested aspects of work, intergenerational justice, path dependence, and policy design. And so I see a comment in the chat box as well. And so I'll post that after I give a pause to see if any of the panelists would like to respond to any of Dr. Raymond's comments. And feel free to just jump right in.
I guess I could start off, and thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Raymond, for providing such a great overview of all of the comment threads between the three presentations. But yes, I would agree, like the intergenerational aspect it's quite important. And that image of the polar bear I started with really showed 12 years ago that focus on not only on people of color, but also on the youth, and how do we build that next generation to understand the impacts of climate change. And I'm, when people ask me, am I hopeful about climate change with all the doom and gloom? I often say yes. Climate change is the greatest challenge our society and planet has ever faced, but it also represents the greatest opportunity for society in terms of public health and how we reimagine our societies, how we plan our cities, and what type of values we want to have in our lifestyles and the way in which we live. And I think the youth demographic has been really influential in that, from the divestment movement, which is sort of the precursor to the Sunrise Movement of these really engaged youth groups working on college campuses, and particularly in large endowments, to force these universities to change their way and their support of fossil fuel-based industries as a form of investment. And that has really spun off to the Green New Deal and taking it to the national level. And from a California perspective, everything that that's why I argue the Green New Deal is not new. These are long-held positions that people of color and environmental justice groups in particular have been working on for 15 years, but that intergenerational connection has spinned that off to a level we've never seen before.
Great, thank you. I'll invite Dr. Johnson or Hoover if you would like to make a comment at this time before we move into the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to hop in. Thank all of you. This has been a great panel, and I appreciate the filling out of the picture that you provided, Dr. Raymond. I think that's really important to do. And I don't have answers to some of the things that you brought up. I will say I have been thinking a lot about, you know, as you mentioned, market-based solutions, right? And trying to think about how do you work in a structure of capitalism while leading with environmental justice. And I apologize if you can hear my dog barking. I don't know. But I think it's a really tricky thing for me, because for the way that I think about, you know, our market system, I start with the assumption that it's based in racial capitalism, right? And how does that then enable us to use any type of benefit cost analysis or other types of, you know, more technocratic solutions if that's kind of the subtle driver behind the system. And I think, you know, Dr. Mendes, you mentioned the different kind of generational aspects of environmental justice. And I think that then layers the complication, because I think a lot of cities are still really stuck in that first generation of EJ, and really just thinking about like, oh, we're finally aware that there is such a thing as uneven geographies, but then still defaulting to you know, very, very engineering hydrologic responses, you know, and Dr. Johnson pointed out, great, like it's not always the case anymore that lower income communities or communities of color are in those low-lying areas because of the way coastal value and real estate has changed over time. And so I think, you know, it's one of the biggest challenges for me in trying to figure out how do we move forward, recognizing that that's where the majority of people are still thinking about environmental justice, and engaging with both practice and the research. And then the fact that engaging this idea of racialized capitalism isn't a part of that conversation yet, and we're not even at that point yet. And I, you know, I don't have any answers, but I think it's something that we're really going to have to seriously incorporate, particularly when we're thinking about, you know, global displacement from climate change, and the way that people are going to be left with no choice but to move, and how that is going to impact different economies of scale. And yeah, so I don't know, but.
Yeah, thank you for that thoughtful response, and kind of struggling through some of these questions, right? Through these really systemic aspects of a lot of the inner workings between racial justice and environmental justice, and trying to think through what that looks like on the ground. At another moment, I'd be really eager to hear more about the inner workings of the methodology that you used in terms of looking at all those city documents. But I want to focus on the panel now and just give Dr. Johnson another opportunity to respond, and also highlight the comments from Dr. Raymond in the chat box saying don't need to answer now, and that please come to the working group sessions this afternoon for further conversation. So thank you so much for that feedback. Dr. Johnson, anything to add to this great discussion before we move on to the next question?
Sure. I'll just mention, since Professor Raymond was talking about path dependencies and specifically mentioned redlining, I'll kind of point out how that's played out in New Orleans over time, and in the context of how we create unintended consequences, and how we need to be careful about how policy changes and programs in one area are going to have feedbacks and consequences in other areas. So I alluded to New Orleans having kind of a unique history with respect to how the risk has evolved over time. One of the reasons why more affluent communities in New Orleans are located, in some cases, at very low elevations, at some of the lowest elevations in the city, is because of redlining in the past, in that there were neighborhoods in the 20s through 40s that explicitly excluded Black populations and Hispanic populations in the city. And that was the location where they focused a lot in that period on public works and kind of draining the water table and building up the levees along the Mississippi. And consequently, that led to that area subsiding much, much faster than other parts of the city. And so now a lot of the kind of economic activity and wealth of the city is concentrated in one of the highest risk areas. And so that's just an example that, you know, policies that are not even necessarily intended to manage risk are going to impact it in some ways, and that we need to be careful about also some of the things that Professor Mendes talked about, that a policy change in California is going to have connections to the global south, or direct impacts or indirect impacts, and that there are, you know, intrinsic connections now between policies that we put in place to manage risk in one part of the world that will have unintended consequences in somewhere else in the world.